Lord of the Oasis. Chapter 461, Viscount Wayne's Shout. It was Viscount Wayne's fault for taking the risk to gather the troops and attack the members of the royal family. This was a sin. He would be dragged to the court of the noble and be punished horribly, a case to warn the world. As for the North County, Viscount Kevin, who was loyal to the royal family, could temporarily take charge of the county. Then eventually, he would have complete control. Hee. Viscount Wayne looked at the few barons and lords in front of him, and a hint of gloominess appeared in his eyes. His family had been in the dukedom of Leo for more than 300 years, and it was not something that could be easily questioned and overthrown. Now, these cute little fellows actually wanted to use him to exchange for the support of the South County. It was really laughable. The danger that the Wayne family had encountered in the past was even more severe than now, but they still managed to survive it safely. Sometimes, danger was not just danger. It was also an opportunity. Enough. Viscount Wayne gritted his teeth and slowly stood up. Beside him, 6 grand knights who were glowing with light were standing beside him in unison. Clearly, these 4 people were Viscount Wayne's trump card, and also the strength that made the nobles opposite him not dare to act rashly. Viscount Wayne, please give us an explanation. However, these nobles were not afraid at all. Although they did not dare to use force, they could try to reason with him. For example, they could persuade Viscount Wayne to put down the weapon in his hand, disarm himself and give up his right to command. After they took control of him, they could negotiate with the enemy commander. In the end, they could even go to the South County. Wouldn't it be great if they pledged their loyalty to Grand Duke Cameron? They would probably settle the score when the time came. They would also be able to obtain a lot of benefits that belonged to Viscount Wayne. This was very common among the noble families, especially the small noble families like them. Once they were able to take down a large noble family, they would be able to quickly grow into a middle-class noble family just by making a fortune from the corpses. Currently, in the dukedom of Leo, many middle-class noble families were able to succeed in this way. In fact, even Viscount Wayne's family had achieved such glory in this way. Viscount Wayne. However, the 3 barons were closing in on them step by step. In addition, the lords and knights at the back were doing the same. Among these people, there were also 3 people whose bodies were emitting bright elemental light. They were obviously grand knights, which was why they were not afraid of the intimidation of Viscount Wayne's 6 grand knights. The battle between a grand knight and a grand knight could be either simple or difficult. However, it was also true that neither side would benefit from the battle. Usually, they would not fight to the death. But things had developed into the worst-case scenario. The ordinary soldiers outside were still waiting for their answer. If they could solve the upcoming difficult battle, it might be a good idea for everyone. Of course, it was not good for Viscount Wayne, who had to take the blame. I understand. Viscount Wayne sat on the chair dejectedly. Looking at the 6 grand knights beside him, he slowly waved his hand forward. I didn't want to do this, but now I have no choice. It seemed like he had given up. The 3 barons and the other lords revealed relaxed smiles, and the 3 grand knights behind him had withdrawn all their extraordinary powers. However, at this moment, Viscount Wayne suddenly looked coldly towards the grand knights beside him. Finish them. Whoosh! The sound of swords being drawn from their sheaths instantly sounded. Just as the others were stunned, the 6 grand knights instantly pounced towards the 3 grand knights. The knight swords in their hands stabbed into their bodies, bringing with them an extremely destructive power of extraordinary power, directly killing the 3 grand knights who had just relaxed and did not have the time to react. Meanwhile, Viscount Wayne had already transformed into a grand knight who had burst out with an extraordinary power of fire, looking coldly at the lords in front of him. Let's see who is going to compromise now, he spoke slowly. His voice was hoarse, and his eyes were filled with killing intent. Ah, you want to compromise, you also want to compromise, and you. He pointed the long sword in his hand at the few nobles whose faces were extremely pale. All of you have a share in this. Viscount Wayne, you know what you are doing. The faces of the 3 barons and the other lords were all pale. Cold sweat was dripping down their temples. What am I doing? Viscount Wayne let out a sinister laugh. What a joke! The long sword in his hand stabbed out instantly, directly cutting open the throat of the baron in the lead. The tip of the sword even pierced the back of the neck. I want to do this. Are you satisfied? You're crazy. The faces of these nobles changed drastically. Slaughtering a noble was a complete death sentence. If they all died here, even if the South County knew the inside story, they would still investigate. Once they found out that Viscount Wayne was the murderer, a crusade would probably appear, turning the former Viscount into a prisoner who had lost his honor. The North County was not the same as East County, it was just a very weak county. Whether it was economic or military, it was very weak. The true foundation of the Dukedom of Leo was still in the South County. In fact, if it was not for the Grand Duke of the South County, Cameron, who felt guilty about his own sister, Countess Agatha, and some of the deals, the troops of the South County would probably have been able to defeat the East County. Of course, if that was the case, they would also suffer losses, and the Silver Platter Kingdom could only benefit. That was why there was no internal strife. But the North County was different. There was no army that could resist the South County. They simply could not imagine what kind of judgment they would receive if they really went against the noble court that was controlled by the royal family and the high-ranking noble. Even the family would probably be humiliated, or even destroyed. But Viscount Wayne did not care. The long sword in his hand swung fiercely, and the heads of those nobles and lords flew into the air. Then it flew out of the tent and crashed heavily outside. Right in front of those knights and knight attendants who were still waiting for the news, it was completely turned into a rubber ball. It rolled and then slowly stopped. This is God, this is my master. This is my master. What happened? What happened? It was already chaotic outside. The knights and knight attendants were shouting in panic, and even more knights drew their long sword. These heads were the masters of many people, but Viscount Wayne walked out of the tent and looked at the knights and knight attendants outside who were drawing their swords at him. He smiled. Do you want to do something big with me? You might die, but you might become a real noble. The faces of the knights and knight attendants were stiff, but the anger in their eyes turned into shock and doubt. This was because the words of Viscount Wayne had completely moved into their hearts. Baron Kent, the second son of Grand Duke Cameron, and one of the heirs of the Dukedom of Leo. Viscount Wayne shouted, "We were originally going to attack him, but after seeing the power of Baron Kent, I think it's a better choice to join him. If Baron Kent can obtain the position of Grand Duke, then we will be one of the meritorious men of Baron Kent. With this identity, how could we not be able to obtain the identity of a noble?" Chapter 462, After the end of the internal strife. Viscount Wayne looked at the knights around him who had drawn their swords. They looked aggressive, but there was hesitation in their eyes. His breathing became heavier, but there was determination in his eyes and face. This was the only way he could survive. Otherwise, even Grand Knights would not be able to fight against such dense formation. There was a limit to extraordinary powers. In a small-scale battle, they were an absolute trump card. However, when it came to large-scale troop battles, they were just a group of better elite troop class. They could kill tens of times more enemies. However, when they were exhausted, they would lose their fighting strength and be knocked down by a huge number of enemies. Then, they would be killed, turning into corpses just like the enemies that they had killed. Especially in the current situation, they were surrounded by a group of hostile troops that could explode at any time. It was even more dangerous. Although there were many knights and knight attendants on Viscount Wayne's side, there were even more troops of those nobles that he just beheaded and kicked them like a ball. There were no more words in the scene. The heavy breathing gradually spread. In the short period of time, Everyone knew the situation through whispers. The reason why they did not launch an attack was because they lacked a leader. The reason why they lacked a leader was because after they learned of Viscount Wayne's words, their hearts were very moved. They only needed another step forward to agree on Viscount Wayne's term. They just wanted Viscount Wayne to give them a convincible explanation. "What did I say?" And Viscount Wayne gave them an out. He puffed out his chest. The power of the Viscount of the North County was undoubtedly revealed. He looked at the familiar knights, his voice was extremely high-pitched. "This is an opportunity, my friends. As long as we seize this opportunity, we might be able to usher in a new glory in the Dukedom of Leo and let our family step onto a higher ladder." The breathing sounds around them became louder and louder. Many of the knights even lowered their longsword. They looked at each other and looked at each other in dismay. Their eyes were filled with interest. In this feudal era, who would really care about this so-called loyalty? Don't joke around. Foolish loyalty only existed among the commoners. Everyone here was all noble or quasi-noble with a family. If they really sacrificed their lives for foolish loyalty, it would be really not worth it. They might even implicate their own family, causing their own family to be completely destroyed. Their descendants would also become lowly commoners. Looking at the knights gradually putting down their longsword, the corners of Viscount Wayne's mouth curled up into a smile. The plan had succeeded. However, his gaze swept to the side. There were a few lords and quite a few knights there, and their faces were still filled with anger. Viscount Wayne knew that these fellows were the same people as those nobles who had attempted to force him surrender his command. They might even be lying in ambush outside. If there really was a military confrontation, they would incite the knights outside to capture him alive. Even if they could not capture him alive, they would not mind using his corpse. After all, the withdrawal of the army was just an excuse. In the end, they would use the family of Viscount Wayne to appease the anger of all parties. A viscount's family fortune was not small. These barons' stomachs were swollen from eating. Even if some lords and knights joined them, they would still have indigestion from eating. One should not underestimate a viscount with real power. He had complete control over the foundation of a county's noble. Although the North County was not that rich, and the land was extremely barren. Even so, after years of plundering and gathering fortunes, it could also allow the Wayne family to obtain unimaginable funds. For example, the vault full of golden eagles was an example. Of course, Viscount Wayne would not say this. Otherwise, he would definitely attract the attention of those bandit groups. Even within his own family, there would be people coveting this wealth. Greed could make people lose their rationality. In this regard, Viscount Wayne expressed that he had the right to speak. After all, he was the example of the rich right now. "Get ready." Viscount Wayne nodded to the 6 grand knights behind him. They all looked at the few nobles who were whispering not far away. Without the slightest hesitation, the extraordinary power on their bodies instantly erupted. They charged forward and launched a sneak attack. Blood splattered everywhere. Broken bodies appeared in front of everyone. Those few nobles had all been killed. The scene suddenly caused an uproar. The surrounding knights picked up their longsword and pointed it at Viscount Wayne. There was nothing they could do. Anyone who found out that their comrade had been killed would do the same thing. No one knew if they would be the next to be killed. This action made the hearts of the knights who had already moved shiver. They also thought of the decisiveness and cruelty of Viscount Wayne. They are all rebels. However, Viscount Wayne did not care. He put away his longsword and wiped the blood on the blade. He said loudly, "I heard the private news about these nobles. They plan to overthrow the rule of the Dukedom of Leo. That's why they organized to attack the pass of the Stone Wall. They plan to kill the second son of the Grand Duke of Leo, Baron Kant, and weaken the ruling power and dignity of the royal family." What? These words immediately caused an uproar among the knights around them. They all knew that they were in fact the invaders. They were the official bandit who wanted to attack the pass and rob the table salt. Now that Viscount Wayne had said that, they still hadn't reacted. That's right. But in an instant, some of them reacted. Then, it aroused the approval of more people. This was originally the conspiracy of the barons and the lords. As for them, they were just pitiful people who had been deceived. They didn't understand what had happened at all. Now, the lie had been exposed, so they understood. Therefore, they would not continue to attack. Instead, they would continue to show their friendliness to Baron Kant because of the respect towards the dignity of the royal family. If they could even follow Baron Kant and become a noble under him. They could lead their own troops and launch the most violent attack for any enemy who dared to provoke Baron Kant. Soon, this conclusion was agreed by the remaining nobles. Everyone stood together. This was a good idea. Then, under the command of Viscount Wayne, an envoy group consisting of 2 Grand Knights and 10 Knights was sent out. In the plain not far away, Firentus, who was originally waiting for Rolf's arrival, actually found that there was a serious internal conflict in the Noble Alliance army. They even fought each other and quickly calmed down. They sent an envoy to contact him. Of course, the condition of contact was for both sides to maintain peace. In Firentus's eyes, this was child's play. There was no such thing in the continent of Karadia. But in this world, it was very different. Those Noble Alliance army really dared to negotiate conditions. They even merged into his army to become an allied army. Chapter 463, The Thoughts of the Nobles. This was the internal conflict between the nobles of the North County. It was a non-fatal conflict that could be mediated. In fact, the two sides of the conflict could even use the interests of each other as the core to establish a mutual aid group that symbolized friendship. The rules of the noble were originally so absurd and ridiculous, but it could also form such an ending that was close to a joke. Thus, this scene appeared. Being a resident from the continent of Karadia, Firentus was more used to speaking with swords and force. He was shocked to find that the Noble Alliance army had collapsed on their own and had actually chosen to submit. Of course, according to what they said, it was considered as offering their loyalty to the new king. As for who the new king was, it obviously the Supreme Lord Kant. Firentus had already thought that his lord, who was also the second son of Cameron, the Grand Duke of Leo, had the second-in-line right to inherit the dukedom. He was a member of the royal family of the dukedom, not a simple noble. Therefore, Firentus received these envoys and promised a peaceful proposal. It was very simple for him. Moreover, he could even keep these noble as cannon fodder. Firentus had also listened these nobles' words. That was to help Kant, the Supreme Lord, walk towards absolute glory. For example, Kant would first ascend as king in the dukedom of Leo, the most important land of grain production among the human kingdoms, and then seek for more estate. It had to be said that after Firentus and Rolf stayed for a long time, their personalities had also changed. After all, this was the real world. The NPCs in the game were all template-like personalities. However, it was different here. The generals could learn from each other and change imperceptibly. It was the same logic that said, if you live with a lame person you will learn to limp. However, at the very least, their loyalty to Kant would not change. They would only change their personalities. Perhaps because of their loyalty to Kant, their personalities would become extreme. Soon, the envoys returned to the Noble Alliance army. This caused a wave of cheers. However, at the very least, their defenses had not been removed. These noble families were also worried. After all, both sides were still fighting to the death earlier. They were still invaders. It was impossible for them to give up their defenses just like that and hand over their lives to the previous enemies. In order to express his willingness to reconcile, Viscount Wayne personally led the team to the outer side of the formation. The envoy was the first stage of the communication. Next, the communication between the noble families was the most important. Firentus also understood this. He brought 50 royal knights over. The conversation between the two sides was still very pleasant. The key was that after the peace treaty was confirmed, these noble families all chose to be loyal to Kant. They also swore under the name of the god of war, and everyone would be the witnesses. Noble families still cared about their face. Even though there was no difference between breaking faith and breaking paper, they still had their own rules. The consequences of breaking the treaty without permission were serious. Except for absolute benefits. No one wanted to be stabbed in the back by their ally at the most critical moment. In other words, if it was necessary to stab their ally in the back, it was definitely a time when benefits could not be refused. If it could be exchanged for more benefits, so what if they did it? One's own interests were everything. The interests of others did not matter at all. The noble were all extreme egoists. It was just that they had put on a decent disguise. Soon, Rolf, who had led his troops back from the plain, also noticed the abnormality in this place. Over 1,000 elite desert bandits spread out and surrounded these noble alliance army in small groups. He personally came to the vicinity of the camp where Firentus was. He looked surprised. He had also noticed the noble families in the camp who were smiling and talking to each other. They were very happy. They didn't look like they were fighting at all. Meanwhile, Firentus was also greeting him. "Rolf, this is Viscount Wayne and the other barons and lords. Let's get to know each other. From now on, we will be working under Lord Kent." "Hey!" Rolf had a ferocious smile on his face. "Viscount Wayne and the other barons and lords." "That's right." Viscount Wayne nodded in a very dignified manner. He stood up and did not care about his status. "Mr. Rolf, the light cavalries that you are leading are really heroic. It made us think that you are probably the strongest general of the light cavalry in the dukedom of Leo." He even placed his hand on his chest. He bowed slightly. "If it's possible, please allow me to pay my respects to you and your light cavalry unit." "Yes, we all pay our respects to your valor." The other baron lords also placed their hands on their chests. Their attitude was so humble that it made the nobles' dignity and modesty look exquisite. "Oh!" However, Rolf bared his teeth and smiled. "That's such an honor." He looked at Firentus, who did not usually get along with him, nodded to him. After a few guesses, Rolf quickly understood the whole situation. "Since we are all going to work under Lord Kent in the future, then please take care of us." He smiled and said, "However, I think we should carry out Lord Kent's new plan now." "What?" Wayne and the other nobles looked up at him in puzzlement. "Attack the South County." Rolf's voice became heavier. "I think we can launch a surprise attack before the South County realizes what's going on. Maybe we can get the reward we deserve." "Ah? Is this an attack on the South County?" The faces of the nobles changed. "Can we reconsider it?" Viscount Wayne looked worried. They were not prepared to really attack the South County. The so-called excuse before was mostly for the ordinary people to hear. Although they had already gave unrealistic statement, they still wanted to give themselves a way out. Were they really going to follow Baron Kant? Stop joking. Even if Kant was a member of the royal family, he was just a baron. All of them were barons themselves. There were even real lords who had their own territory and troops. Even the knights had fief villages. It was impossible for them to simply rely on a noble. Therefore, while they agreed verbally, they already had other idea in their hearts. When they returned, they would observe again. They would pretend that nothing had happened. If Baron Kant's army was really powerful, then it did not matter. They had already pledged allegiance to him today. They could be considered as one of their own people. It would be great if they could rely on Baron Kant. If the South County expressed their dissatisfaction or did not acknowledge Baron Kant's indirect control of the North County and formed an invincible army, then they would pledge allegiance to the royal family that had come to the South County. After all, they were originally nobles conferred by the royal family. Most of them were members of the noble family who lived in this system. They were naturally friendly. In any case, it was a civil war. The nobles had thought well. They just needed to learn how to skillfully form a battle team. Chapter 464, Conjectures brought about by strength. However, taking a side definitely did not mean that they were completely on the other side. If the situation was still unclear, they would not put all their forces on one side. Most of them were secretly involved with each other. If something really happened, there was still a chance to remedy it. A crafty rabbit has 3 burrows. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. That was more or less what it meant. Noble families were very shrewd egoists. Why would they really seek refuge with a certain party? Especially now. They had only sought refuge with Kant out of fear of danger. If everything were to be resolved, they would even go to the South County. They would lick the shoes of the royal family and high-ranking noble families, begging for forgiveness and loyalty. There was nothing they could do. In their eyes, the strength of the South County was much, much stronger than Kant's. This was because the Dukedom of Leo was supported by the South County. As for the other counties, the East County was considered wealthy and could barely be considered as a strong county. However, the North County was a barren highland. It was the territory of the Dukedom of Leo in name. Their noble system was separated from the mainstream noble circle. Any noble who committed a mistake would be sent to the North County. That's right. Some of the former nobles from Dukedom of Leo who committed mistakes were sent to North County, no matter they were from South County or East County. Because of the poverty of the North County, those nobles who made a mistake would never have the ability to go against the South County. It could be seen from now on. The North County's noble alliance army was only slightly stronger than the mercenaries. And this was because of the training. Looked at the equipment, some of the mercenary elites were even better than the noble knights of the North County. Therefore, the noble families of the North County had a deep affection for the South County, which was the most elite part of the Dukedom of Leo. After all, they used to be a family, and they also dreamed of returning. Now, it was impossible for them to say goodbye to the noble families of the South County. Moreover, it was a war with the South County. On the spot, the faces of Viscount Wayne and the other nobles changed. However, the ones whose expressions changed were not only Rolf who had made this suggestion, but also Firentus, as well as the 50 royal knights behind him who had already surrounded them. This was their home ground now. This group of nobles, who were already equivalent to captives, still dared to resist? Viscount Wayne was somewhat dumbstruck. Looking at the 50 royal knights releasing their extraordinary powers, his originally confident heart suddenly felt a burst of amusement. He immediately burst out laughing. Perhaps it's not that bad. The surrounding barons and lords could not stand it, their faces were pale as they looked at so many grand knights. Even the Dukedom of Leo did not have so many grand knights. Let alone the North County? With these royal knights standing there, all the noble families were so scared that they did not dare to move. Their previous thoughts were instantly put away, especially when they looked at the royal knights with pairs of vigilant and threatening eyes under their helmets. They all revealed embarrassed smiles and looked at each other, their eyes filled with helplessness and fear. They clearly knew what these grand knights represented. They represented the absolute trump card. If it was a large-scale battle, a troop with 50 grand knights would be able to pierce through the formation of over 10,000-man troop at the crucial moment, creating a very advantageous chance for their own side to ensure victory in the battle. This point had been proven through practical examples. It was on the battlefield of the Dukedom of Leo and the Silver Platter Kingdom 10 years ago. How could Cameron defeat the main force of the Silver Platter Kingdom? It was all thanks to the strength of the Grand Knights. What's more, at that time, the leader was only 20 Grand Knights, leading 300 fully armed knights. At the critical moment, they charged out from the flanks of the main force of the Silver Platter Kingdom and forcefully defeated them. They directly cut through the formation of the Silver Platter Kingdom and even directly killed the commander of the main force of the Silver Platter Kingdom. If not for that, even if Baron Dylan rebelled, Dukedom of Leo would not have won this battle. This was also the key reason why the Dukedom of Leo could last until now. However, there were the 50 Grand Knights in front of them. Behind them were 1,500 plus fully armed heavy armored cavalries, including 1,000 plus elite light cavalries. Then, thinking about the existence of at least 2,000 plus footmen and 1,000 plus archers at the Stone Pass, they realized that Baron Kant's strength had far exceeded their imagination. A few days ago, they could still vaguely hear the news of the East County. It seemed that there had been a huge change. However, because of the blockade, they could not find out the details. However, they could vaguely know. A powerful force that had originally occupied the main force had been destroyed in a short period of time. Some of the noble families that belonged to the East County, but secretly contacted the North County and South County, also said that all of this was because of Baron Kant. However, they were more specific, and they did not dare to reveal too much. At one time, they thought that this was a plot by the South County to take back control of the East County. But now that they thought about it, perhaps it really was because of Baron Kant. After all, with so many Grand Knights and elite heavy cavalry here, they could already be considered as one of the top noble forces in the Dukedom of Leo. They were almost no less than those ancient families that had existed for hundreds of years, even before the establishment of the Dukedom of Leo. Those ancient families were the high-ranking noble families, the top and pillar of the Dukedom of Leo. They had been passed down for hundreds of years. There were a lot of foundations left behind by these ancient families. For example, Grand Knights who possessed extraordinary powers were rare to see among ordinary noble families. However, to those ancient families, they were perhaps just ordinary members who had deliberately hidden themselves during normal times. They would only appear at the most crucial moment and act as a surprise weapon to save the situation. On the surface, there were less than 10 Grand Knights recorded in the Dukedom of Leo. However, there were at least 50 of them in the dark. This was the era of feudal lords. The power of royalty and the power of the noble families were contending with each other. In fact, it was even inferior to this era. It was not a unified empire. The royalty could do whatever they wanted and control everything. If they wanted to count the population or wage war, they would need to discuss with the noble families. They would also need to compromise with each other and fight openly and secretly. For example, it was impossible to expose such a foundation so easily. Especially now. The Dukedom of Leo seemed to be stable. In fact, it was in a state of disunity. The noble families had ulterior motives. The orders from the Grand Duke of the Dukedom of Leo were completely worn out before they could leave the South County. This was partly because the ancient families wanted to maintain balance. It was also because the situation in the Dukedom of Leo had already reached a stalemate. It was equivalent to a muddy pool of stagnant water. The class was extremely solidified and even conflicted with each other. Classes were established among the nobles, small circles of nobles emerged as well as those who opposed to each other. The commoners were controlled and completely followed the nobles. Chapter 465, Negotiation with the Wayne family. While Viscount Wayne and the other barons were looking awkward, on the flat and barren land of the North County, a group of people had already started to move forward. They formed a long dragon formation in a mighty manner, and their target was Grathan Castle. That was the political order and political center of the northern county, and also the residence of Viscount Wayne's family. To the north was the plain. And to the south was the relatively fertile mountain of Leo. There were countless streams in the mountain range. Although most of them flowed towards the south, there were also a few that flowed to the north. They went around the foot of the mountain and formed a small river, barely nourishing the soil at the foot of the mountain. At the very least, it would allow Viscount Wayne's family to be self-sufficient in agriculture. It was the only good place in the North County. But now, there were many changes in this good place. On the city walls of Grathan Castle, the troops responsible for guarding the castle were ready. Sword-shield soldiers, lance soldiers, archers, and crossbowmen were also waiting for orders behind the city gates and on the city walls. There were close to 1,000 of them and their weapons were well equipped. They were all elites with resolute expressions, fearless of life and death. These were the true foundations that the Wayne family had trained and nurtured over the course of 100 years. There were even 2 Grand Knights among this group of people. Including Viscount Wayne and the 6 Grand Knights under him, the Wayne family already had 9 Grand Knights. It had to be said that these noble families were really well hidden. According to the official records of the Dukedom of Leo, Viscount Wayne was the only Grand Knight in the North County. There was no one else other than him. However, thinking about it carefully, there were already 2 Grand Knights at the Stone Pass, plus Viscount Kevin's castle. They were all well hidden. But even so, it did not matter to the cavalry below and outside the castle, which numbered close to 3,000 people. 50 royal knights were all Grand Knights and had extraordinary powers. They were not being able to directly attack the city. However, they could form a large-scale assault force in the field that could easily break through the infantry formation of tens of thousands of people. Together with the 1,500 heavy cavalries and 1,300 light cavalries, it would not be a problem to defeat an infantry group of less than 30,000 people. Even without these royal knights, just the number of heavy cavalry and light cavalry was enough to intimidate them. Now, the members of the Wayne family were all trembling in fear. Even the faces of the sons of Viscount Wayne, who were wearing full-armed mail armor and chain armor, were turned pale. Such a large-scale heavy cavalry force was rare in the North County. The most important thing, his father was in that huge troop. And Viscount Wayne had asked to open the door for these unfamiliar troops. Thinking back to the time when the Noble Alliance army attacked the Stone Pass together, and now they were brought back by an unfamiliar army, it was not difficult to guess the outcome. They had definitely lost the battle. If they had lost a battle, it would have been fine. At most, they would have closed the castle and defended it. But their own father, the head of the Wayne family, was in the enemy's troop. The young people really did not know what to do. But more than that, after a short meeting, they decided not to open the city gates. There was still room for discussion. If they opened the city gates and let the unfamiliar army rush into the castle, then there would be no discussion. Even their safety could not be guaranteed, let alone the family members inside. The Wayne family might not have a family head, but they definitely could not be cut off. It was not as if the family head had never died on the battlefield. But there was one point. As a noble family, they definitely could not cut off all of their bloodlines. Bloodlines were the signs of a family's inheritance. Looking at the history of those once glorious families, because all of their members were killed, their inheritances were cut off in the end. This also meant that their family's glory was cut off, and they were completely wiped out in history. Although their Wayne family was not a high-level family, it was definitely not a small family. Being able to occupy the North County showed one's own strength. If one wanted to continue the bloodline of family, one had to learn how to sacrifice. Even those young people who had yet to completely take over the family had some ulterior thoughts. In the past, their father, Viscount Wayne, was still in his prime, so they couldn't have much right. Now that their father was suddenly captured, and they became closer control the power of the family, this feeling was very good. In less than half a day, the entire family had depended on them. Because they were facing the danger of execution. There was no other way. That was why they could unite as one. However, just as this group of people were daydreaming, an envoy arrived. Phyrontus personally led the team, followed by 10 royal knights. They came to the city gate and told the defending soldiers that they hoped to talk. The willingness to negotiate was quickly confirmed. A huge basket was placed on the city wall, which could fit 3 people. Phyrontus didn't find it strange. He led 2 royal knights to the city wall and negotiated with the infantrymen of the Wayne family who were secretly on guard. As an experienced noble, Phyrontus also noticed their uneasiness. He smiled elegantly and said, "We do not have any hostile thoughts." "Is that so?" The one in charge of the negotiations was the eldest son of Viscount Wayne, who was also the first successor. "Then please send my father back to the castle, and then ask your troops to leave the castle's range of 3 kilometers. These can actually be done. Phyrontis nodded with a smile. Can be done, the eldest son frowned. So, you mean that there is a price to pay? That's right. Phyrontis nodded. Looking at the eldest son who was the same age as him, he said, Logistical supplies, this is the price you have to pay. Hey, the eldest son was stunned. What do you want to do? He looked at Phyrontis, it was as if he was looking at a madman. I know that you are the subordinates of Baron Kant, but you have to know that the troops of the South County are 10 times stronger than those of the North County. This is absolutely not an alarmist. This is the truth. Is that so? Phyrontis chuckled, but his words were still firm. I still need to tell you that I need to guarantee the logistical supplies for my troops, and then nothing will happen. Otherwise, we will act irrationally. Yes, the eldest son did not have any objections. He gritted his teeth and said, but I can only secretly fund you and not sign any contracts. No problem. Phyrontis smiled and nodded, it's a pleasant deal then. But the eldest son said quietly, then what about my father? And the troops my father took away? I need to see them. He said, his tone was extremely grave. The noble families of South County are absolutely powerful in our eyes. We cannot follow you to attack South County. Especially when you fail, we will be hunted. That won't do. Phyrontis continued to chuckle, your family is already willing to cooperate with us. At the same time, Viscount Wayne has already represented the Wayne family and pledged his loyalty to Baron Kant. This is the truth. Chapter 466, Deep Thoughts in the Tent. In the end, the gate of Grathan Castle of the Wayne family didn't open. Instead, more and more soldiers were guarding with weapons and equipment on the city walls and towers. They were ready to defend the city to the death and resist the impending siege. No one could be trusted, even if the family head was there. Even if they had negotiated, they would not open the city gates in order to ensure their safety. This was for their own consideration, not even for the sake of the Wayne family. They had already formed a situation where they would rise and fall together. If something unexpected happened, their wealth and family would not be guaranteed. In this seemingly peaceful feudal era that was in fact extremely chaotic, the castle was the ultimate reliance. As long as they relied on this sturdy castle, even if tens of thousands of enemy troops arrived, they firmly believed that they could defend with the city defense fortifications of the castle. It was simply too difficult to attack a castle head-on without siege equipment and without an insider inside. It was so difficult that even if all the troops were wiped out, they might not be able to take it down. This was the conclusion drawn from history and experience. Even Grand Knights had to worry about the ballistae on the city walls and towers. These siege weapons were not a joke. They were very effective. However, under the peaceful negotiation between the two sides, they maintained the greatest restraint. There was no intention to fight, but there was absolutely no so-called peace. On the contrary, both sides were clearly divided and did not invade each other. However, Wayne still had to provide the necessary logistical supplies. For example, they had to provide the necessary food and bedding for the troops, as well as a lot of clothes that had to be changed. These cavalry troops were still fine. The key point here were footmen rushing over here in 2 days. They were the main factor in ensuring the logistics. These noble alliance army that originally belonged to the various noble families in the North County, who wanted to take advantage of the chaos to make a fortune in the Stone Pass or the Naran Desert, were eventually kidnapped and forced to head to the South County. That's right, they were kidnapped because their family head or the noble families that were loyal to them were all kidnapped. Right beside Phyrontis, they were strictly guarded by 50 royal knights. They enjoyed treatment that even an ordinary king could not enjoy. At the very least, the political enemies of the kings did not have the ability to send out 50 grand knights with extraordinary powers. One had to know that even if there were more than 50 grand knights secretly in the current dukedom of Leo, they were distributed in 3 counties. Even if there were more Grand Knights in the South County, they would not be controlled by a single force. However, Baron Kent had so many formidable forces under him. To these noble families, it was as if they had boarded a pirate ship and could not get down. If they wanted to get down, they would have to wait for their strategic goal to be achieved before they could do so. Viscount Wayne and those nobles stayed in a large tent alone. There were no guards inside. There were only 2 Grand Knights protecting them and a Grand Knight's tent beside them. If there was an unexpected event, they could rush in at any time. It would probably take less than 10 seconds. Looking for trouble? The result would be nothing but death. These nobles cherished their lives very much, so they lay on their respective blankets and slept soundly. Anyway, they had eaten their fill, so they could just wait for the result in peace. Things had already come to this, so should they run away or risk their lives to send a message to the noble families in the South County? Come on, what if Baron Kent really could take over the South County? Even if Kent couldn't make it, they were being coerced after all. Now that they were arrested here, were they really going to risk their lives to showcase their loyalty to the Dukedom of Leo? Impossible, what a joke. The current Dukedom of Leo was no longer the dukedom that was united as one 10 years ago. Even the current Grand Duke of Leo, Cameron, had a bit of a dubious reputation when he ascended the throne. It was absolutely impossible for them to show their loyalty in battle. Right now, they were unwilling to. Viscount Wayne sat on the blanket and looked at the dark object not far away through the gaps of the tent. He knew that his family had spent 30 years to build and expand Grathan Castle based on the previous Viscount's foundation. It was simply an indestructible war fortress. If they wanted to attack this castle, they were not probably to success even if all the current cavalry troops were wiped out, because they had no siege weapons. But what he was most worried about before was that his inexperienced sons would open the city gates and surrender. At that time, the entire Wayne family would be completely destroyed. It was not that these Baron Kent's troops would go in and rob them, but that they would definitely be wiped out by the South County after they had completely surrendered to Baron Kent. They could still be considered as a hostage. They could use the Golden Eagle to make connections and smooth things over. But once the city gates were opened and Wayne Castle was used as the foundation, then it would all be over. Viscount Wayne did not believe that Baron Kent would be able to invade the South County and ascend to the Dukedom of Leo. Although in the eyes of many nobles, the current Grand Duke of Leo, Cameron was the same position as them. The prestige left behind by the Leo family could still make many nobles choose to listen to the orders of the Grand Duke. Moreover, the South County and the high-ranking noble families could not sacrifice the current Grand Duke of Leo, Cameron. The interests of both sides had long been involved to an extremely deep extent. Whoever was eliminated would cause a great change. It would hurt them very much. This was also the reason why the South County was able to band together. Their interests were all linked together. If Baron Kent's forces entered the South County and expelled the forces of the Grand Duke of Leo, Cameron, then high-ranking nobles like them would definitely be wiped out as well, because it would affect their interests. And the emerging forces would definitely provoke and antagonize the existing forces. Unless there was a big enough cake. But at the moment, the Dukedom of Leo was a small piece of cake. The richest and most fertile place had already been eaten by the noble families of the South County. Now that the newly joined Baron Kent had come over, not only did he want to snatch the most beautiful cake from the mouth of the original royal family, but he also wanted to snatch the cake from the mouths of others. That would be no different from a bandit, an enemy. Even if he did not snatch the cake from the mouths of others, would the others believe him? Exceptional ability and strength would attract jealousy. Most importantly, how could they allow others to seize their belongings? How could the noble families of the South County, who had already formed an alliance, let Kent took their things? Their territory must never change, just like how they would never tolerate their own interests being snatched just like that. Once Kent's forces entered the South County, he would be met with the most violent resistance. Even the pushback from the battlefield. Chapter 467, Rolf's Thoughts. There was a reason for Viscount Wayne's worry. In fact, even those noble families who seemed to be asleep in the tent couldn't sleep. They were also feeling uneasy. When they surrendered to Kent at the last minute, it meant that they tacitly agreed to his control over the North County. All of this was very logical. After all, there was no more powerful noble force in the North County than Kent. According to the rules between the noble families, if Viscount Wayne could not suppress Baron Kent, then he would slowly lose the right to rule the North County. After a certain period, his title of the Lord of North County would be stripped. And it was just like that when the Wayne family replaced the previous family of the North County. It was all an unspoken rule between the noble families. But it was very useful. If that was the case, Viscount Wayne was certain that his family would not decline within 10 years. If he allied with some of the great noble families in the South County who were hostile to Kent, perhaps his family could still be saved in the North County. Thus, he had nothing to fear. After all, Baron Kent's mother had been framed by some of the noble families in the South County. If he did not help himself, then Kent, who had control of the North County, would not be easy to deal with. He would become a big shot. The North County's estate was vast. Although it was barren, the salt mines in the Naran Desert had replaced the traditional agricultural income. As long as they had money, people, and power, then even if the great noble families in the South County fought back frantically, if they could not crush Kent in one blow and give him a chance to catch his breath, it would be very difficult. With money opening the way, any fractions would have to think about whether or not to ease the relationship with Kent. The noble families did not always know about hostility, especially at the crucial points. For example, Baron Kent's own strength was not weak, or even very strong. Maintaining a good relationship and forming an alliance for life and benefits was the best choice. And it was precisely because Kent had this idea that he had already taken control of the military power of the North County. He had also completely used the salt mine to attract the attention of many greedy noble families, especially after he had displayed his military strength. As long as he slowly plotted, he would be able to easily gain a foothold in the dukedom of Leo and become a rising noble. However, things were hard to predict. How could he have expected that Baron Kent not only obtained the North County, but also dragged them towards the South County right away? This was not a subtle attack on the North County, but a complete attack on the South County to start a civil war. It would cause a war between the two counties. Viscount Wayne and the other nobles were worried about this. All of them were silent, but in their hearts, they were a little desperate for their future. The troops of the North County and Baron Kent's troops would definitely not be able to directly attack the core area of the South County, but even if they did, they would still be defeated by the defensive counterattack of the top-tier noble. The foundation of those top-tier noble families was many times stronger than the newly promoted noble families like them. If Kent was defeated and it was their turn to be punished, the consequences would be unimaginable. While everyone was tossing and turning, the night gradually brightened up. Dawn had arrived. The sound of footsteps and shouts gradually appeared around the tent. Many desert bandits acted as squires and went to a brook not far away to fetch water to provide daily drinking for nearly 3,000 people and war horses. They also prepared breakfast for the next day. At Grathan Castle, the city gate had already been opened slightly. 5 carriages filled with bread, sausages, and smoked meat came out. At the front was an old butler. He was already very old. His hair was white, and his expression was quite grave. He looked like he was determined to go on a suicide mission. This old butler held the reins and left the castle with the carriage. He had the resolution of not being returned alive. He straightened his back and slowly approached the camp with a dignified look. 10 elite desert bandits went over with spears in their hands to ask questions. They would soon come back together. This was the temporary supply from Grathan Castle that day. The 5 carriages were full of food, which could feed nearly 3,000 people for 3 meals. According to the old butler, the castle was still preparing the war horses' feed. Because the quantity was too large, it would be released later, and the specific time would be noon. Of course, this was a very considerate move. No one cared. "All right, old man, you can go back." Rolf, who was in charge of the surrounding defense, also smiled and waved the old butler away. However, the old butler bowed respectfully without losing his dignity. "Lord, please allow me to see my master, Viscount Wayne. I am his servant, the most loyal butler. I should accompany him and take care of him." "Take care of him?" Rolf sneered. "He is a living person, and he can't take care of himself." "No, you misunderstood," the butler said gently. "A real noble should enjoy the care of a servant. This is the privilege of a master, and I am his loyal servant. I should take care of him." "Oh, okay." Rolf nodded. "You can go." "Thank you very much." The old butler bent down again and was led to the tent by the desert bandits. Hee hee. Rolf only showed a disdainful expression and looked at Firentus, who was walking over. He pointed at the old butler with his chin and said, "Look, another good dog. He really treats himself as a servant. I have never seen such a person in Karadia. Even my most loyal servant would not be willing to be a servant forever. His servility is too strong." Firentus also looked at the old butler and shook his head. "Don't bother about him. How's things going on? Have you sent someone to contact Lord Kant? Our strategy is a little too risky. It's better to take risks." Rolf grinned. "It would lead to great harvest." "Humph." Firentus was a little dissatisfied. "This kind of thing should be discussed with Lord Kant. We are too far away." Rolf said indifferently. "I have already sent people to inform Lord Kant. It is said that he has already established a Nordic village by the Resnistican river. It has already begun to develop." He paused and looked at Firentus. "You don't want the Nords to seize the initiative, do you? With that group of water ghosts?" Firentus snorted coldly. "If they are fighting on the plains, they are just a bunch of country bumpkins trampled to death by Swadian under the hooves of horses." "That's true." Rolf chuckled. "But beside them is a river. That's their strong point." His tone also became a little more serious. "Lord Kant needs to develop. We can take the opportunity to make the dukedom of Leo fall into chaos. As long as we can rely on the Noble Alliance army this time and obtain even the slightest victory, the North County will be completely dragged into our war chariots. When that time comes, whether or not they submit to Lord Kant will not be up to them." "Yes." Firentus nodded, and his face turned solemn as well. "I hope so." Chapter 468, The Worry of Viscount Kevin. At noon, the feed had been prepared by Grathan Castle. A total of 8 carriages were transported to the camp. However, at this time, Firentus had already arranged for people to feed their war horses, but he did not give the order to set off. Instead, he reorganized the camps. They were waiting for the arrival of the infantrymen. The Noble Alliance army were still walking slowly behind. From time to time, desert bandits would go over to scout or urge them, so that those who had lost their high-ranking commanders could quickly keep up with the pace. At the same time, they would publicize the obligations they would have to face in the future. That was to follow Baron Kant and seize the authority that belonged to him, the title of Grand Duke of Leo. Of course, there were also empty promises. Firentus and Rolf had already promised them. As long as they followed Baron Kant and made contributions to the war, they would be conferred the title of noble status. If they could obtain the final victory, they would also have enough land to wait for everyone. They would treat everyone equally, and all of them would be rewarded. Even if they died in the end, they would give their families a lifetime of food allocation. Baron Kant had a mountain of gold and silver in his possession. It was just a small amount of money. It was an easy burden. This was also the greatest confidence that he could use to coerce and entice the ordinary soldiers. In the current dukedom of Leo, who did not know that Baron Kant had a salt mine? who did not know that Baron Kent was extremely rich. They did not incite them too much. Those desert bandits only explained the situation, how much money Lord Kent had, and how much money he would have in the future. Those infantrymen who were born poor and commoner were as loyal as if they had been brainwashed. Modern educated people could be brainwashed by pyramid schemes, let alone the stupid commoners of the feudal era? They could be induced to gain something. They could often burst out with extremely high enthusiasm. Moreover, these commoners did not need to make too good a wish. Just the fanatical group effect could make everyone fall into a dream of a beautiful future, and then develop into madness, becoming wild beasts that could not be controlled. Once they embarked on this path, other than forcibly ending, they could not stop. Whoever wanted to stop would be going against them. The consequences were unimaginable. Of course, just 2 days later, the Noble Alliance army had already arrived at Grathan Castle. Along the way, there were endless supplies, and there were only a few civilian infantrymen that escaped. However, the vast majority of those who escaped were caught up by the desert bandits, and their heads were easily cut off in the plain. They were hung on the reins of the desert horses, and they stared blankly with their lifeless eyes as they rode on their horses. The remaining heads made all those who wanted to escape feel a chill in their hearts. Threats and rewards. They could not do it without any links. However, this simple method was very effective. After the Noble Alliance army arrived at Grathan Castle, they did not rest for long and set off the next day. Their target was the route led by the light cavalry troop formed by the elite desert bandits. In fact, they were following the mountain range of Leo and straight into the South County, preparing to attack a castle that was independent of the North County. Moss Castle. This castle was ruled by Viscount Kevin. It was located at the junction of the North County, the South County and the East County. To the west was the Mountain of Death, to the east was the mountain range of Leo, and to the north was the endless barren plains of the North County. To the south was the fertile plains of the South County and Lionheart City, and to the southeast was the Lion Fort of the Grand Duke of Leo. It was located at a strategic location and could be said to be the best barrier or fortress. The north could isolate the North County. The south could control the South County. The core hub of the rear of the Dukedom of Leo. Whoever could control this place would be able to have the advantage in the terrain of the Dukedom of Leo. And now, Viscount Kevin, who controlled Moss Castle, naturally belonged to the Grand Duke of Leo, Cameron. They were childhood friends, and the relationship between the two was extremely close, even to the extent of surpassing that of their own siblings. It couldn't be helped. Siblings could still fight to obtain the position of Grand Duke. But this kind of friend wouldn't. Instead, they could become your good ally. This was very solid in the Western feudal system, where bloodline, title, and identity were respected. But now, Moss Castle was in a dilemma. Viscount Kevin was standing above the city gate. Looking at the empty horizon, there was anxiety between his brows. Is he crazy? He clenched his teeth and clenched his fists. He's really crazy. He received the news a few days ago. It was confirmed yesterday. He really didn't expect Baron Kent to defeat the Noble Alliance army. Then, he led the surrendered troops and rampaged all the way to attack the South County. According to the report of the reconnaissance cavalry, they would arrive in 1 day. This was the first time that Moss Castle had faced a threat from the North County. Although his mission was to monitor the North County, the Moss Castle mainly acted as a backstop and support, as well as a central point, completely blocking the main forces of the Silver Platter Kingdom from invading. It also provided a foothold for the main forces of the Dukedom of Leo that had retreated from the South County. What was worth laughing about now was that the greatest enemy, the Silver Platter Kingdom, had not invaded. Instead, the North County, which had only been used as a deterrent, was about to bring a war. This had resulted in the lack of sufficient preparations in Moss Castle. The military supplies that should have been purchased in large quantities in the South County had been seriously in short supply in the warehouse. After all, in the original plan, this was only the foothold and the focus of the battle. Even the dukedom of Leo had given up on this place and planned to retreat to the plains and fight with the cavalry of the Silver Platter Kingdom. The North County was different from the South County. The plains of the South County had been developed into fertile fields, and there were farms everywhere. The North County was really a flat and barren plain and wilderness. Apart from a few places with water, there were very few farms or villages. The other places were completely uninhabited. As for the terrain of the North County, it was more than 3 times larger than the South County. It was indeed a place suitable for plains and field battles. But now everything had become very different. Moss Castle was facing the threat of the troops of the North County, while the South County was still in a stalemate. Viscount Kevin had already sent out the news of the rebellion of the North County, but the South County had yet to send back any news. In his opinion, this was undoubtedly foolish. He had even combined it with the news he had heard before. For example, the destruction of the priests on Mountain of Death. This had deepened his fear. Of course, Moss Castle had connections with the Crimson Sect on Mountain of Death. After all, it was at the border of the 3 counties. It would be inconceivable if there was no connection between them. However, Viscount Kevin did not have too deep a relationship with the Crimson Sect, so he did not know how the Crimson Sect had been destroyed. However, thinking about the sudden change of the noble families in the East County, he could guess it. Perhaps there was a great change in the East County, which led to the destruction of the Crimson Sect. However, no matter what, the situation was extremely bad for him. After all, Moss Castle was also on the side of the East County. Although he was not responsible for the important transportation areas of the East County and the South County, he could still be used as a side support. Could it be? Viscount Kevin hesitated. The situation is going to change. Chapter 469, The Beginning of the General Attack. Just as Viscount Kevin was feeling nervous, the reinforcements from the South County had yet to arrive. On the contrary, on the morning of the next day, grey fog rose up from the plain in the north. At the same time, under the grey fog that was like showing off and brandishing its fangs and claws, one could vaguely see many figures. Like an arrogant long dragon, it slowly approached Moss Castle. "It's coming." Viscount Kevin's voice was trembling. He swallowed his saliva and forcefully suppressed the fear in his heart. He waved his hand and shouted, "Everyone, pay attention. Pull up the drawbridge and the city gate. All the soldiers go up the city wall. Archers go up the tower. Speed up." "Yes," the orderly voice rang out in the castle. The soldiers were all shaking. Soldiers holding crossbows and war bows quickly appeared on the tower and the city wall. These were the soldiers that the Kevin family had trained since young. Their loyalty was trustworthy. After a long period of military training, they were also not bad in shooting and close combat. They could be considered a group of elites. Moreover, in terms of combat ability, they were slightly better than the regular infantrymen of the North County. This was the strength of Viscount Kevin. Unfortunately, they were really outnumbered. Currently, there were only 500 elites stationed in Moss Castle. The rest were a group of conscripted militias that they gathered from the surrounding villages. There were even a group of armed peasants who were doing menial work. They wore slightly thicker clothes and came to the castle. On their backs were pitchforks or sickles on their waists. Their combat ability was not strong, it was impossible for them to kill with their current equipment. They did not even have proper leather armor. They were probably cannon fodder who would be killed on the battlefield. It was indeed the case. There were more than 3,000 of them, but one shouldn't be fooled by their number. Although they were all young and strong, they had not received proper military training. They could do nothing except to be helpers. The most suitable place for them was still the farmland. It was much easier to harvest those crops than to go to the battlefield, especially on the battlefield where they were harvesting their dead. Some people had just walked onto the battlefield that was filled with the smell of blood, and they were so scared that they couldn't move their legs at all. In comparison, the over 1,000 conscripted militiamen were not too bad. They had at least received military education. They were trained by the castle infantry during their free time. However, they only knew the most basic of spear thrusts. This was enough. If they were to form a formation on the city wall, they could completely protect the safety of a section of the city wall. Moreover, they were all wearing leather armor made of cow leather. Although their defense was inferior to mail armor, they could still withstand normal attacks. Sometimes, because of the toughness of the cow leather, they were even better at blocking arrows. At the very least, mail armor would be vulnerable to more serious secondary damage because of the iron ring. Enough. Viscount Kevin knocked his head. He did not understand what he was thinking, but looking at the formation that was already set up in the distance, his heart trembled even more. His breathing became extremely heavy. What exactly are these people doing? In the distance, the Noble Alliance army began to set up their camp. A large number of tents were facing the rising sun. According to logic, they should launch an attack. Even if they did not launch an attack, it would be good to make some preparations first. But those Noble Alliance army actually made preparations for a long-term confrontation. This really made Viscount Kevin confused. This made him ready to defend to the death and make use of the advantage of the castle to heavily crush the allied army of Kant's side. The other side had come all the way here. Since they were prepared to rest, they would definitely come again after they had recovered their morale. If that happened, it would probably be an extremely tough battle, which would be disadvantageous to him. Although defending the city had a natural advantage, Viscount Kevin did not have much confidence in his weaker troops. He did not have much confidence in defending against the elite troops of the North County. Although his castle had the mission of monitoring the North County and controlling the checkpoints here, it was definitely not a fortress to defend against the army of the North County. It had a 6m high and 2m wide wall. It also had a 13m tall castle. If they relied on such a medium-sized castle, the elite forces of the defending troops would be severely lacking. In addition, their material reserves were low, so they could not defend for a long time. They did not even know when the reinforcements would arrive. Thinking about this, Viscount Kevin felt that his head was about to explode. After all, the current situation was completely unsolvable for him. Especially the most crucial thing, he only had 2 Grand Knights under him. And he swore that there were definitely more than 5 Grand Knights in the Noble Alliance army. They were all nobles who also did the shady little thing. All of them had hidden some Grand Knights under their force without reporting to the official. This was called foundation. It was at this time that it came into play. But current situation was very awkward, his foundation didn't seem to be of any use. Because even those 2 subordinates who were Grand Knights, when they saw the 10,000 plus infantrymen and 3,000 plus light and heavy cavalries outside, they had already sent a message to their subordinates, saying that they absolutely couldn't leave the city to engage in field battles. Just a glance was enough to destroy their thoughts of engaging in battle. Their confidence collapsed. There was nothing they could do. The difference between the forces of both sides was too great. Viscount Kevin did not expect that the Noble Alliance army of the North County, who had originally gone to attack the Stone Pass, would be defeated so easily. Instead, they had become the core force in attacking the South County. This was simply a joke. It was no wonder that even the noble families of the South County were still in a daze. They really did not know what had happened. The weakness of the noble families had appeared. Without knowing what had happened, they knew that Moss Castle was facing absolute military pressure, but they still argued with each other and pushed the other party to handle this matter. After all, as long as the South County didn't suffer heavy losses, their interests wouldn't be harmed. And in this argument, Moss Castle was facing more and more pressure. Because at noon, the Noble Alliance army that had already rested and reorganized began to take action. Even the siege weapons provided by the Wayne family had begun to be assembled. There were catapults with long arms and all sorts of ballistae outside the city walls. It seemed like they were going to forcefully attack the city. That was indeed the case. At 1 p.m., the catapults and ballistae creaked. With a command, the heavy round stone shells were throwing in a beautiful arc and smashed heavily onto the stone walls. With a clang, the broken stones scattered in all directions, announcing the start of the siege. More than 10,000 Noble Alliance soldiers also began to forcefully attack the northern city gate. Those ballistae were also whistling and smashing the stone bullets towards the city gate. The situation was extremely critical. Even Viscount Kevin did not expect that the other party did not even feign attack and directly started the general attack. Because of this, he could not help but laugh like he was going crazy. What is that Baron Kant thinking, directly launching the general attack? Do these guys know what a siege is? There is such a tactic. But as the attack began, his mental pressure gradually increased to a point where he couldn't it anymore. The situation was too dangerous. Chapter 470, the castle was finally been broken through. The Noble Alliance army, who had already assembled the siege equipment, began the prelude to the siege attack. One after another, round and polished stone balls were directly thrown out by the long arm of the ballista. They drew a beautiful curve and heavily smashed into the city wall. The splashing stones flew around and smashed into the bodies of the soldiers guarding the city. The soldiers covered their body parts that were hit and groaned in pain. If they were hit at the vital parts or the hands and legs that were not protected by the leather armor, it would take their lives. They fell on the city wall on the spot and lost the chance to continue fighting. It was the same as leaving the battlefield. The Wayne family had defended Grathan Castle for decades and had accumulated a lot of resources to defend the city. These included the catapults, ballistae, stone bullets, and lances. These were all kinds of reserve resources in the castle. The purpose was to use Grathan Castle as the center of resistance after the South County was fallen. They could also deploy their cavalries and take advantage of the vast plains of the North County to exhaust the infantry troops of Silver Platter Kingdom on this battlefield. It was like bleeding, forcing the invading troops to retreat and even return the land they had already occupied. This was the strategic plan of the Dukedom of Leo. Unfortunately, Moss Castle was not going to put in use any longer. This was because Kant's subordinates, Firentus and Rolf, were pressuring the knights to attack Moss Cast, If they broke through this place, the door of the South County would open in front of them. At that time, it would be up to them to decide whether they wanted to declare an invasion or not. Meanwhile, the South County was still evading. The war had begun. But it was not the defensive battle against the Silver Platter Kingdom that they had originally expected. Instead, it was Kant, an exiled baron that they didn't care at all. But now, he had fought his way back. The second son of Grand Duke Cameron, the son of Princess Sophia of the Silver Platter Kingdom, had the second in-line inheritance right. He had already occupied the entire North County, and according to the news that came, even a small portion of the East County had been occupied by that young man. The flames of war raging at Moss Castle. The catapults and ballistae whistled as they threw stone balls. Terrifying tremors shook the heavens. But they had to continue the attack. The people of Moss Castle were still defending. Although the castle that they had spent decades building was not a top-notch castle, it still had a good defensive effect. Most importantly, after these catapults and ballistae bombarded wildly, although a little of the city walls had collapsed, the main body was still standing. The casualties of the castle soldiers were also within 200 people, so it was not considered to be a serious loss. According to the conventional battle method, if they wanted to capture this castle, they would have to pay at least thousands of casualties. However, Firentus and Rolf were not prepared to do that. Too many casualties would affect the morale of the troops. The Noble Alliance army, which had been bribed and threatened by them, could not afford to suffer setbacks. On the contrary, they needed a complete victory. They had to take down the Moss Castle. Therefore, they issued an absolute order, requesting the Wayne family to disassemble all the siege weapons here. They also ordered the infantrymen to throw stone balls at the city wall and bombard the main body of the city wall day and night. This was also very effective. With each impact, the city wall creaked, and cracks appeared on its surface. The city wall couldn't hold on for too long. After all, the construction of the city wall of Moss Castle was just a layer of stones on the outside, filled with crushed stones and soil on the inside, and then a layer of stones on the outside. It looked solid. If a section of the city wall was blasted open, then the entire city wall would completely collapse. And now, that section of the city wall that had been deliberately bombarded with concentrated firepower was really about to reach its limit. After a whole morning of bombardment, it was around 3 p.m. The city wall was covered with dents of various sizes. The entire city wall was visibly dented inward, and cracks even appeared on the city wall. There were no soldiers left on the city wall, and they didn't dare to stay here any longer. In fact, the entire defense of the city wall had already been abandoned. Instead, they had arranged more soldiers to defend the main body of the castle. The castle was the most important defense system. The city wall was only an obstacle to delay the enemy's attack from the outside. By the time the city wall fell, the enemy's siege weapons, and their morale would also be depleted. At that time, defending the castle would be even easier. At least defending the castle itself was more practical than defending the city wall. Boom! Finally, under the continuous bombardment of the ballistæ, the city wall finally collapsed. Smoke and dust immediately spread in all directions. A large amount of gravel and soil tumbled down. The soldiers on the surrounding city walls and towers seemed to have received some orders. They quickly gathered and appeared behind and on both sides of the collapsed city wall. Next, it was time to start the defense around the collapsed city walls. This was also a good time to attack the attackers. During the siege, it didn't mean that the collapse of the city walls meant that the castle had fallen. The collapse of the city walls was only a small section, and it wasn't even 5 meters wide. However, it was precisely the 5 meters wide opening, and there would always be troops stationed at the rear. If the Noble Alliance army wanted to attack, they could only turn this place into a meat grinder. This was a battlefield where life was consumed, and it was also the main position where the defenders could consume the morale of the attackers. The attackers often had the resolution of death. This resolution was reflected in climbing the city wall or directly attacking the city gate. Once it was consumed, the overall morale would drop. It was different from the defenders, who could recover as long as they encouraged the morale. The longer they dragged it out, the greater the advantage of the defenders, especially when they could all retreat to the main body of the castle and wait for reinforcements. They had an absolute advantage. In the feudal era, it was unbelievable to attack a castle that was completely sealed and had food and water reserves. There were even records stated that a troop was able to defend a castle for several months, yet the enemy still could not break in. Under the situation of a Western feudal lord, a castle siege attack that lasted for several months was very impressive. Attack! Rolf swung his sword forward. Behind him, groups of infantries of the Noble Alliance army began to charge. They closed in step by step with their long lances in hand, and soon approached the collapsed city wall. However, the rain of arrows that came from the front quickly poured down. Groups of infantries of the Noble Alliance army fell to the ground, but more people rushed straight into the castle. Just now, the 10,000-man army had launched a total attack. They did not care about the casualties at all. Even inside the city wall, Viscount Kevin was on the main body of the castle. He was dumbfounded when he saw this scene. His original arrangement was to prevent the enemy from probing the attack. But now, the enemy launched a total attack. The 10,000-man army rushed over like a tide. No matter how the archers at the top of the city wall shot and the ballista on the towers bombarded the ground, it was like they were splashing water in the sea. More and more infantrymen rushed in the castle crazily. And they fought until the city wall collapsed.